Sarah, honey, what's wrong? Is it the baby? I barked into the phone, already pushing back from my home office desk, where I'd been remotely monitoring a scheduled system update. Her voice came through, tight with tears, and a fury I knew all too well, the kind reserved for soul-crushing bureaucracy and people who chew with their mouths open. Mike, you need to come home. Right now. Doris? That witch. Doris towed the car. My car, the one with the hospital bag in the trunk, Mike. The one with the baby seat we just installed. She what? My own voice went flat, a dangerous calm settling over the initial surge of adrenaline. Why? Are you okay? Where are you? I'm on the porch, she sniffled. She said it was parked 2 inches over the stupid white line on our own driveway apron. 2 inches, Mike. I told her I couldn't exactly squeeze out and repark it easily these days, that my back was killing me, and it was our spot anyway, practically on our lawn. I tried to stop them, but the tow truck was already here. She just stood there, smirking. I was out the door in seconds, keys in hand, shouting a, "Stay inside, stay calm, I'm on my way," over my shoulder to Sarah's distraught voice. The 10-minute drive from my home office setup back to Primrose Path Estates, our little slice of suburban heaven, usually, felt like an hour. My mind raced. Doris Miller, president of the Primrose Path Estates Homeowners Association, was a woman whose obsession with rules made the Spanish Inquisition look like a casual book club. But towing a heavily pregnant woman's car at night over 2 alleged inches? That wasn't just overzealous. That was malicious. That was war. I screeched, as quietly as a man consumed by righteous fury can screech, into our cul-de-sac. The familiar silhouette of Sarah's sensible blue hatchback was, indeed, gone from its usual spot on our driveway apron, that little paved pad just before the garage. In its place was a gaping, accusing emptiness. Sarah was on the porch, wrapped in her favorite fluffy pink robe, illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light, one hand protectively cradling her enormous belly. Fresh tears were streaming down her face. "She was horrible, Mike!" Sarah choked out as I rushed up the steps. "I told her, I showed her how hard it is for me to get in and out right now, how I might have just nudged the line a tiny bit because I couldn't see it properly in the dark when I got home from Mom's. She just quoted some bylaw about uninterrupted sidewalk access. But it wasn't even on the sidewalk. It was our apron. The tow driver, this young kid, he looked almost embarrassed, but she had this look of triumph, Mike. Like she'd just won the HOA Olympics." As if summoned by the dramatic recounting of her villainy, the porch light of the house directly opposite ours. Doris Miller's impeccably manicured, aggressively beige, rule-abiding fortress flicked on. Doris emerged, a vision in a severe, quilted beige robe, her iron-gray hair already encased in a phalanx of perfect curlers, a clipboard somehow, impossibly, already in her hand. Her expression was one of profound, smug satisfaction, the kind a cat gets after successfully knocking a priceless Ming vase off a mantelpiece. Mr. Henderson," she declared, her voice carrying across the dew-dampened lawns with chilling clarity. "I see you've discovered the unfortunate but entirely necessary consequences of flagrantly disregarding community bylaws. A shame it had to come to this, but rules, as they say, are rules." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head, then counting to 10 again in binary just for good measure. "Doris," I began, my voice dangerously calm, the kind of calm that usually preceded a critical system-wide server reboot. "It is almost midnight. My wife, as you can plainly see, is 8.5 months pregnant. You have just had her car, which was parked in our designated residential area, towed, allegedly because it was 2 inches, 2 inches, Doris, over a line that, if memory serves, you and your beautification committee painted yourselves last week with what looked suspiciously like leftover house paint." Doris remained unruffled, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her thin lips. The lines are official demarcations, Mr. Henderson, clearly delineating the precise boundary between private driveway aprons and community pedestrian thoroughfares, as per Bylaw 7, Paragraph B, Subclause 4, revised and distributed last spring. Your wife, I might add, received a verbal warning as recently as last month about her vehicle consistently encroaching upon said thoroughfare. Sarah, bless her fiery hormonal heart, let out an indignant squawk. You never said a single word about the car, you interfering old bat. You complimented my prize-winning petunias and then passive-aggressively suggested they might attract unapproved pollinator species. I put a restraining hand on Sarah's arm. Arguing with Doris Miller was like trying to reason with a particularly stubborn fire hydrant. I looked from Doris's smug, implacable face to Sarah's tear-streaked one, her hand still protectively on her belly where our little kicker was no doubt reacting to his mother's distress. That did it. The last shred of my carefully maintained professional calm snapped. I pulled out my phone. All right, Doris, I said, my voice now devoid of any warmth whatsoever. Rules are rules. Let's just make sure all of them are being followed tonight, shall we? To the letter. Doris actually scoffed, a sound like air escaping a punctured inflatable gnome. And who might you be calling at this late hour, Mr. Henderson? The parking fairy? Perhaps your lawyer? He'll be hearing from our HOA's considerably more expensive legal counsel in the morning regarding the retrieval fees, the outstanding fines for consistent non-compliance, and possibly a cease and desist for your unneighborly attitude. I ignored her, already dialing a number I knew by heart. A number not many people had for a Tuesday night. Sarah watched me, a mixture of hope and trepidation in her eyes. Yeah, Jim? I said into the phone, my voice still quiet, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of steel that made Doris's smirk falter just a fraction. Hey, it's Mike Henderson. So sorry to call you this late, buddy. I know you're technically off rotation tonight, but I figured you'd want to know. Listen, I've got a bit of a, well, let's call it an unneighborly dispute, rapidly escalating into potential malfeasance and endangerment here in Primrose Path Estates. I glanced pointedly at Doris, who was now looking less smug and more sharply attentive. Our esteemed HOA president, a Mrs. Doris Miller. Yes, that Doris Miller. I believe you've had the distinct pleasure at those tedious county planning meetings where she argues about the precise shade of beige for public benches? Well, Doris just had my very pregnant wife's car illegally towed from our designated private property. She's claiming it was 2 inches over a line. My wife is understandably distressed. There's vital medical equipment and the baby's hospital bag in the car. You get the picture. I'm at my house, 123 Primrose Lane. How quick do you think you could swing by and, mediate this delicate situation? I listened for a moment, a faint smile touching my lips. 15 minutes? No, Jim, with all due respect for your off-duty relaxation, I was thinking more along the lines of 5. Let's just say the situation feels like it could benefit from your immediate, authoritative, and possibly siren-accompanied presence. Yeah. Thanks, Jim. I definitely owe you another one. Steakhouse of your choice. See you in a few. I hung up. Doris was staring at me, that tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in her eyes, now definitely more annoyance than amusement. Or perhaps it was the first dawning inkling that she had just kicked a hornet's nest that was far larger and far more strategically placed than she could have possibly imagined. Well, Mr. Henderson? Doris finally managed, her voice a little higher pitched than before. Was that your influential friend? I assure you, no amount of string-pulling will supersede the clearly written and legally binding bylaws of Primrose Path Estates. This community has gone downhill with entitled residents like yourselves who believe the rules simply don't apply to them. That vehicle was a hazard, an eyesore, a blatant disregard for the aesthetic harmony and pedestrian safety of Primrose Path. Her voice was rising in volume, a sure sign she was losing control. "Aesthetic harmony, Doris?" I shot back, my patience worn thinner than her excuse for a rule. "Or your desperate need to control every blade of grass and every painted line because your prize-winning petunias keeled over last summer and you still haven't gotten over the humiliation at the county fair?" It was a low blow, based on some delicious neighborhood gossip, but damn, it felt good. Doris sputtered, momentarily lost for words, her face flushing a rather alarming shade of puce that was definitely not on the HOA's approved color palette. She then rallied, launching into a litany of other supposed infractions we, the Hendersons, had committed over the past year, our wind chimes being excessively tonal and disruptive to migratory bird patterns, our welcome mat being of a non-regulation whimsy level, and my personal favorite, the unauthorized and frankly alarming cheerfulness of the sunflowers Sarah had planted along the fence line. I gently guided Sarah inside, away from Doris's escalating monologue of suburban grievances. I settled her on the couch with a glass of water and a cool cloth for her forehead. "What are we going to do, Mike?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "The baby's car seat is in there, the hospital bag, my lucky birthing socks that Mom knitted. What if I go into labor tonight because of all this stress?" Hey, look at me," I said softly, taking her hands. "Don't worry about any of that right now, sweetheart. It's being handled, I promise. Just breathe with me. Remember what Dr. Evans said about staying calm, nice deep breaths." My own calmness, a forced composure I was desperately trying to project, seemed to be having an effect on her. It was also, I noted with grim satisfaction, visibly unnerving Doris, who was still out on her perfect porch, probably lecturing a bewildered garden gnome about the proper spacing of decorative pebbles. She kept peeking through her impeccably aligned blinds. She'd expected hysterics, pleading, maybe even a shouting match. She was getting quiet, unnerving confidence, and something else. I glanced at my watch. 4 minutes and 27 seconds since I'd hung up with Jim. Then, a faint sound in the distance, a siren, growing louder, and then another, a deeper, more authoritative wail joining it. Doris, who had evidently given up on the gnome and was now pacing her porch like a caged panther in a beige pantsuit, stopped dead. "Well, now what's that unholy commotion?" she snapped, more to herself than anyone. Probably someone else breaking the 10 p.m. noise ordinance with their unmuffled vehicular existence. The sirens got very close. Very, very close. Red and blue lights began to flash and dance across the pristine, sleeping facades of Primrose Path Estates, painting Doris's horrified face in intermittent shades of emergency. Not one, but 2 Williamson County Sheriff's Department cruisers, lights now strobing with an almost festive intensity, pulled up with surprising quietness, parking directly in front of Doris Miller's house. They effectively boxed in her prize-winning rose bushes and her view of anything else. Out of the lead car stepped Sheriff Jim Brody. He was a big, imposing man in his late 50s, built like a retired linebacker, with a weathered, lived-in face, a no-nonsense haircut that hadn't changed since the Reagan administration, and eyes that had seen everything Williamson County had to offer, good, bad, and Doris Miller. He wasn't in his formal uniform. It was nearly midnight on what was supposed to be his night off, but he was wearing a dark Sheriff's Department polo shirt, tactical pants, and his badge was prominently displayed on his belt. His sidearm was visible. He looked tired, but he also looked like he was about to wade into a swamp full of bureaucratic alligators and wasn't remotely intimidated. He walked straight to my porch, completely, pointedly ignoring Doris, who was frozen mid-stride on her top step, her mouth agape, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a life raft in a hurricane. "Mike," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He nodded gently to Sarah, who had come to the doorway, her eyes wide. "Sarah, you folks okay? What in the Sam Hill is going on out here?" Sounded urgent when Mike called. Doris, recovering her voice with a sound like a strangled goose, scurried over, clipboard somehow still brandished. "Sheriff Brody, what on earth are you doing here? This is a simple internal HOA matter, a parking violation. Mr. Henderson is clearly overreacting and wasting valuable county resources with his histrionics." Sheriff Brody turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable, but decidedly not friendly. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice dropping a few degrees, "we meet again. And it's Sheriff Brody to you, ma'am, always has been. Now, last I checked, my county resources are allocated based on potential breaches of peace, suspected unlawful actions, and calls for assistance from concerned citizens, not your HOA's social calendar. However, Mike here—" He clapped a familiar, heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes of camaraderie and shared late-night coffee over system crashes. "Tells me you had his very pregnant wife's car towed from their private property at—" He ostentatiously glanced at his own sturdy, no-nonsense wristwatch, making a show of it. Precisely 11:58 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, causing her considerable emotional distress. Is that an accurate summary of your internal HOA matter? The sheer unadorned familiarity between myself and the sheriff, the first-name basis, the casual but firm hand on my shoulder, the immediate, unquestioning lights and sirens response to my call, was the first sledgehammer blow to Doris Miller's carefully constructed facade of absolute authority. This wasn't just a resident calling the local police precinct about a noisy neighbor. This was someone calling the sheriff himself on his night off and getting an immediate, top-priority response. Doris sputtered, her face a mottled patchwork of indignation and dawning panic. "It was a clear violation, a blatant disregard for parking regulations. Section 7, paragraph B, subclause 4. I have photographs. Well, I will have photographs from the tow company as evidence." "Ma'am," Sheriff Brody said, his voice still dangerously calm, "with all due respect to your undoubtedly fascinating and meticulously cross-referenced bylaws, I find myself less concerned about your homeowners association's artistic interpretation of a painted line right now, and significantly more concerned about potential vehicle theft by deception, harassment of a vulnerable individual, specifically a woman in an advanced stage of pregnancy, and what appears to be a clear and flagrant abuse of authority if this tow wasn't 100% kosher by state law and county ordinance, not just your little rule book. Did you, personally, authorize this tow, Mrs. Miller? And can you show me, right now, the specific, unambiguous, and legally compliant documentation for said authorization? Including, but not limited to, prior written warnings for this specific vehicle and this exact infraction, as delivered to Mr. or Mrs. Henderson." Sheriff Brody then pulled out his own official county-issued cell phone. "Deputy Carmichael," he said to one of the deputies who had now joined him, a young, sharp-looking woman with a notepad already open and pen poised, "get me the name and contact number of the tow company Doris Miller here uses for her community enhancement activities. Mrs. Miller, I trust you have that information readily available on that impressive clipboard of yours?" Doris, looking increasingly like a cornered and rather malevolent badger, reluctantly provided the name through gritted teeth. "Reliable Ronnie's 24-hour towing and roadside assistance." The sheriff got Ronnie himself, the owner, on the phone. The entire cul-de-sac, now dotted with curious, pajama-clad neighbors peeking from behind perfectly aligned blinds and tastefully understated shrubbery, could practically hear Ronnie's voice getting smaller, squeakier, and considerably more panicked with each passing second of the sheriff's side of the conversation. "Yeah, Mr. Ronnie," Sheriff Brody rumbled into the phone, his voice like granite chips in a cement mixer. "This is Sheriff Jim Brody, Williamson County. I understand one of your drivers, a Bill, I believe, just towed a blue sedan, license plate XYZ 123, from 123 Primrose Lane here in Primrose Path Estates, on the verbal authorization of a Mrs. Doris Miller, representing the Homeowners Association. Now, Mr. Ronnie, was that vehicle located on public property, blocking a fire hydrant, or otherwise posing an immediate and verifiable public safety hazard? No, you say? It was in a designated residential parking spot on private property, merely adjacent to the owner's garage. And the complaint, as relayed to your driver by Mrs. Miller, was that it was allegedly 2 inches over a painted line. Right. Well, Mr. Ronnie, you are going to instruct your driver, Bill, to turn that tow truck around this instant and bring that blue sedan back to 123 Primrose Lane, completely undamaged and without any charge whatsoever, and I mean 0 charge to Mr. or Mrs. Henderson. Or your truck, your driver, your entire fleet, and possibly your license to operate within the sovereign borders of Williamson County, are going to have a very, very bad remainder of the evening, and likely several fiscal quarters to follow. Am I making myself absolutely crystal clear? Good. And Mr. Ronnie? You can send the bill for this little late-night escapade, including any inconvenience caused to my friends the Hendersons, directly to Mrs. Doris Miller personally, or to the Primrose Path Estates HOA, pending a full and thorough investigation by my office into their potentially predatory and unlawful towing practices. Have a blessed night." He hung up with a decisive, almost deafening click. The silence that followed was thick enough to spread on toast. Doris looked like she might actually faint. The remaining color had drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, unhealthy gray that clashed horribly with her beige robe. Sheriff Brody, with the patience of a saint dealing with a particularly obtuse and willfully obstructive sinner, then began to calmly, methodically, and very, very publicly question Doris Miller about the incident. Deputy Carmichael took copious notes, her pen flying across the page. Deputy Rodriguez, a stoic man with an impressive mustache, positioned himself slightly behind Doris, a silent, uniformed reminder that this was no longer an HOA squabble. The sheriff asked about the specific bylaw she had cited, its exact wording, when it was last updated and ratified by the community, how it was officially communicated to all residents. He asked for her evidence of the infraction. Did she personally measure the alleged 2-inch encroachment? With what precise, calibrated measuring device? Did she take clear, time-stamped photographs documenting the infraction and a certified measuring tool in situ before authorizing the tow, as any reasonable person pursuing a legitimate claim would? Were there clear, unambiguous, legally compliant parking demarcation lines, or just some faded, flaking paint that she, or her committee, had touched up themselves with a can of Oops paint from the local hardware store? He then moved on to the HOA's official, documented process for authorizing a tow, especially a non-emergency tow, from private residential parking at nearly midnight. Was there a formal, minuted vote by the HOA board for this specific, punitive action against the Hendersons? Or was it a unilateral decision made by Mrs. Miller in her capacity as— what was her official title again? Ah, yes, President of the Beautification and Compliance Committee. How evocative. Doris tried to wave her clipboard to quote sections and sub-clauses from her leather-bound copy of the CC&Rs to assert her rapidly evaporating HOA authority. "Sheriff," she protested, her voice cracking under the strain, "with all due respect, you have no jurisdiction over the internal bylaws and covenants of Primrose Path Estates. This is a private matter, governed by our contractual agreements with the homeowners." "Ma'am," Sheriff Brody replied, his voice still deceptively mild. "I have absolute jurisdiction over potential criminal acts, civil rights violations, breaches of the peace, and violations of state and county law that occur within the geographical boundaries of Williamson County. And right now, what I'm seeing, on its face, looks a lot like predatory towing, possibly harassment, a potential abuse of process, and a significant overreach of any legitimate authority you might think you possess. State law, Mrs. Miller, often has very specific, non-negotiable requirements for towing vehicles from private property, requirements that, I assure you, supersede your HOA's little rule book, particularly concerning adequate written notice, proper, legally compliant signage, and the immediate, verifiable nature of the alleged violation. Did you, for instance, his eyes narrowed just a fraction, provide Mr. and Mrs. Henderson with a formal, written 24-hour warning notice regarding this specific alleged parking infraction, delivered by certified mail or personal service, before you ordered their vehicle to be towed in the middle of the night, as required by Williamson County Ordinance 3.14, subsection B, for all non-emergency private property tows not involving an immediate safety hazard?" This, I knew, was a key legal point. Williamson County had cracked down hard on predatory HOA towing a few years back after a particularly egregious case involving a disabled veteran. I, in my capacity with the county, had helped draft some of the clearer language for the ordinance revisions regarding notification protocols. Jim Brody knew that ordinance like the back of his hand. He'd probably helped write parts of it, too. Doris Miller visibly crumpled. She had no such paperwork. Her evidence consisted of her own indignant assertion and a vague recollection of mentioning something to Mrs. Henderson about tidiness near the begonias last July. Her process had clearly been, "I saw it, I didn't like it, I called Ronnie's because they give the HOA a kickback. I mean, a discount." She became flustered, then defensive, then accusatory. "It's people like them with their disregard for precision who ruin nice, orderly neighborhoods." Then, as the full weight of two deputies diligently writing down her every panicked utterance, and a growing crowd of increasingly unsympathetic, pajama-clad neighbors watching her public unraveling, she actually became tearful. "I was just trying to uphold the standards," she wailed, tears now tracing paths through her carefully applied night cream. "No one respects the rules anymore. It's all chaos. The petunias this year were an absolute disgrace, and don't even get me started on the inconsistent height of the mailbox flags." Just then, headlights appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac. Reliable Ronnie's tow truck, looking far less imposing and considerably more sheepish now, reversed slowly and carefully towards our driveway. The driver, Bill, a young guy with a mullet and a terrified expression, who looked like he'd rather be wrestling an angry badger than facing Sheriff Jim Brody, practically tripped over his own steel-toed boots in his haste to unhook Sarah's hatchback. He scurried over to me, his cheap plastic name tag reading Bill Towing Professional askew, cap clutched in his trembling hands. "Man, Mr. Henderson, ma'am," he stammered, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I am so sorry. Mrs. Miller over there. She called it in, said it was urgent, a repeat offender, blocking emergency access. Though, it clearly wasn't, now that I see it properly. Showed me her fancy HOA president photo ID badge thingy. Said it was all official, all cleared with, the authorities. I need the work, you know? I got kids. And Ronnie, he said—" Sheriff Brody cut him off, his voice stern but not unkind. "You also need to verify authorization properly, son, especially when it involves a private property tow ordered by an HOA in the middle of the night for a non-emergency situation. You know the county regs. You and Mr. Ronnie are lucky. Mr. Henderson here is a reasonable man, and Mrs. Henderson isn't currently going into active labor on her front porch due to undue stress and agitation. Consider this a formal warning for you and for reliable Ronnie. Next time, verify with our dispatch before you hook up a car under these kinds of circumstances. Got it?" Bill nodded miserably, his mullet quivering. "Yes, Sheriff. Loud and clear, Sheriff." He gave me a look that was equal parts grateful and terrified, then practically sprinted back to his truck once Sarah's car was safely back in its exact, to the millimeter, I made sure, spot. Sarah rushed to check the trunk. The hospital bag, thank God, was untouched. Her lucky birthing socks were safe. As Doris was being formally cautioned by Deputy Carmichael about wrongful towing procedures, potential harassment charges, and the advisability of memorizing Williamson County Ordinance 3.14, and possibly issued a citation for creating a public disturbance, depending on how strictly the deputies wanted to interpret her earlier shrieking. Sarah, now much calmer with her car safely returned and the immediate crisis averted, turned to me, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder in her eyes. "Mike, honey," she whispered, leaning against me, the warmth of her a comforting anchor in the lingering chaos. "How on earth do you know Sheriff Brody so well? I mean, I knew you worked with him on county stuff, but... And how in the name of all that is holy did he get here from his home way over in Miller's Creek in, like, literally 5 minutes flat? That's gotta be a new land speed record, even for Jim." I smiled tiredly, putting an arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "Well, Jim and I do go way back, you know that, to when I first started with Williamson County, trying to drag their ancient mainframe systems into the 21st century. And Miller's Creek, if you take the back roads and, observe the suggested speed limits with a certain degree of professional latitude, is only about an 8-minute drive if you hit all the green lights." I paused, a mischievous twinkle in my eye, despite the exhaustion. As for the 5 minutes, I lowered my voice, though most of the neighbors were now giving their own impromptu statements to Deputy Rodriguez. "Remember that new county-wide integrated emergency communications and dispatch system I designed and project managed the installation for last year? The one that links the sheriff's department, all the municipal and volunteer fire stations, and every EMS unit in a 1,500 square mile radius with redundant, fail-safe comms, real-time GPS tracking for all units, and direct-to-officer secure mobile data terminals?" Sarah's eyes widened. "The Williamson County Coordinated Emergency Response Network Project, the WC-CERN? The one that had you basically living on stale coffee pizza crusts and pure adrenaline for 6 solid months and almost made you miss our anniversary?" "The very same," I confirmed with a weary grin. "Sheriff Jim Brody was the lead county stakeholder for all law enforcement integration. We spent a lot of late nights in the main county server room together, him chain-drinking lukewarm coffee and worrying about response times, me wrestling with legacy code, fiber optic nightmares, and interagency data sharing protocols. He kind of owes me a few. Plus," I added, "he has a special appreciation for the system's efficiency, especially its direct priority override communication channels. And, as it happens, he really dislikes any kind of bureaucratic bullying, especially from overzealous HOAs abusing their tiny sliver of perceived power. I may have mentioned Doris Miller's increasingly creative interpretations of the bylaws to him once or twice before, in a professional capacity, particularly when her obsession with visual tidiness started bordering on obstructing clear emergency vehicle access on some of the narrower feeder streets in the newer developments. Doris, though ostensibly being spoken to by a very patient Deputy Carmichael about the finer points of respecting citizens' rights, overheard enough of this exchange. The realization that Mike Henderson, her quiet, unassuming neighbor, who mostly kept to himself, wasn't just some random resident she could push around with impunity, but was, in fact, a key Williamson County systems engineer, the architect and gatekeeper of the very emergency network the sheriff and every first responder in the county relied on, and someone who clearly had the sheriff's personal ear, direct line, and profound respect, dawned on her with the force of a physical blow. The remaining color, if any, had dared to return, drained completely from her already pasty face, leaving it a ghastly mottled gray. This was a catastrophic, world-altering miscalculation. She hadn't just annoyed a neighbor. She had royally, epically, messed with someone who held the digital keys to the kingdom, someone well-connected, highly respected by the county's top law enforcement officer, and perhaps most terrifyingly, someone who knew exactly how all the systems worked. Witnessing Doris's complete and utter psychological deflation, and emboldened by the sheriff's firm, no-nonsense handling of the situation, and his clear, unwavering siding with the Hendersons, the other neighbors, who had been lurking in the protective shadows of their regulation-approved shrubbery, began to emerge and speak up. One by one, they hesitantly, then with growing confidence, approached Deputy Rodriguez, their voices a rising chorus of long-suppressed grievances. "Officer, she fined me $50 last spring because my wind chimes were allegedly too discordant for her delicate sensibilities," declared Mrs. Periwinkle from 3 doors down, a woman who normally wouldn't say boo to a goose. She tried to make me repaint my legally permitted, perfectly sound, and rather charming garden shed because she didn't like the hue of the eco-friendly water-based stain I used. Said it lacked appropriate solemnity for a storage structure. Added Mr. Henderson, no relation, the grumpy one with the surprisingly artistic birdhouses. She sent me 3 certified letters and threatened legal action because my son's portable basketball hoop was, and I quote, 3 1/4 inches too close to the designated sidewalk easement for a period of 72 hours while we were on vacation, chimed in young Mrs. Albright from the corner lot. A veritable Pandora's box of HOA microaggressions and petty tyrannies burst open right there in the middle of Primrose Path, under the relentless, unforgiving flashing lights of the sheriff's cruisers. Doris Miller looked like she wanted the earth to open up and swallow her, her beige robe, and her wretched, rule-filled clipboard. Sheriff Brody, after his deputies had taken copious notes from the assembled, newly emboldened, and surprisingly eloquent residents of Primrose Path Estates, pulled Sarah and me aside, his expression now a mixture of professional concern and wry amusement. "Mike, Sarah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am truly sorry you both had to go through this ordeal tonight, especially in your condition, Sarah. This clearly isn't just about a poorly painted parking line. This appears to be a persistent pattern of harassment and a significant abuse of authority. My office will be looking into the legality of Primrose Path Estate's current towing contract and their overall enforcement procedures. I strongly advise you both to file a formal, written complaint with my office tomorrow morning detailing tonight's events, wrongful towing, infliction of emotional distress, the works. Document everything. Keep copies of everything." He then lowered his voice slightly, a glint in his eye. "And Mike," he said, "purely as a friend and as a fellow resident of Williamson County who appreciates, shall we say, efficient systems, you and your neighbors should seriously explore the options laid out in your HOA charter for recalling a board member, or, even better, initiating a full review and overhaul of these frankly ridiculous bylaws. This level of petty despotism is bad for property values, ironically enough, and it's certainly bad for community morale and peaceful cohabitation. My office will, of course, support any legitimate investigation into the HOA's past practices if further official complaints and evidence warrant it." He gave a subtle nod towards the group of neighbors still animatedly talking to Deputy Rodriguez. "Looks like you might have a quorum for a revolution already." The immediate future for Doris Miller looked bleak, and not in an aesthetically pleasing HOA-approved charcoal gray sort of way. She was facing potential personal fines for the wrongful tow, As the sheriff had made abundantly clear reliable Ronnie should bill her or the HOA directly. The not insignificant cost of the illegal tow itself, and the very real, looming threat of coordinated legal action from the Hendersons, and now, possibly, a class of other similarly aggrieved residents. The HOA's legal counsel, a slick firm from downtown that specialized in aggressive covenant enforcement, when they heard the full, unvarnished story, especially the sheriff's direct personal intervention and Mike Henderson's rather unique position within the county's critical infrastructure, might very well advise the HOA board to cut Doris loose, arguing she had acted recklessly and far outside established legal towing protocols, thereby exposing the entire association to significant liability. Her reign of terror, built on fear, intimidation, and a truly astonishing misinterpretation of beige, was effectively over. The story of Doris's midnight tow and the sheriff's miraculous 5-minute arrival became an instant, whispered legend in Primrose Path Estates, passed from one liberated homeowner to another over hastily convened backyard fence conferences. The next day, Sarah, feeling remarkably better after a good night's sleep and the lingering thrill of righteous victory, insisted we briefly consult with a sharp, energetic young lawyer specializing in HOA disputes whom Sheriff Brody had discreetly recommended. "Tell Eleanor I sent you. She owes me for that zoning mess her uncle got into." Eleanor Ramirez, ESQ, upon hearing the details. The heavily pregnant wife, the midnight tow over 2 inches of disputed paint, the sheriff's personal, lights and sirens intervention, Mike's crucial role with the county emergency systems, and the chorus of supporting testimony from other oppressed residents was practically vibrating with legal zeal. Her eyes shone with the predatory gleam of a shark who has just spotted a particularly hapless, rule-obsessed seal. "Oh, this is beautiful," she declared, after we'd laid out the whole sordid tale. "This is a gift. A veritable feast of procedural violations. We can have an absolute field day with this. Selective enforcement, clear harassment, demonstrable infliction of emotional distress, improper towing procedures, failure to follow state and county ordinances regarding notice and signage. Did she ever complain about your grass height too? They always complain about grass height. This isn't just a case, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. This is a public service. We'll not only get your expenses covered, but we'll also seek punitive damages and injunctive relief against Mrs. Miller and the HOA to prevent any future creative enforcement of their so-called bylaws." Weeks later, Primrose Path Estates was a subtly yet profoundly changed place. An emergency HOA meeting had been called by a coalition of outraged and newly emboldened residents. Doris Miller, facing a recall petition with an overwhelming number of signatures and the cold, hard reality of impending legal battles she could not win, had tearfully, and rather theatrically, resigned from her presidency and all committee positions, citing unforeseen health concerns and a sudden desire to explore minimalist basket weaving in a less judgmental environment. The HOA board was subsequently restructured. The bylaws were undergoing a resident-led review with a particular focus on excising clauses that were ambiguous, punitive, or just plain stupid. The new acting HOA president was Mrs. Periwinkle, the sweet old lady whose wind chimes had once been deemed too discordant. Her first official act was to declare, "National plant, whatever flowers make you happy day." Mike and Sarah were in the final, joyful stages of preparing for their baby's arrival. Sarah's blue hatchback was safely, and quite deliberately, parked a good 3 inches over the now fading white line on their driveway apron, a small, daily act of defiance that brought a smile to both their faces. The offensive line itself was scheduled to be pressure-washed into oblivion at the next Community Beautification Day, a new event focused on collaborative gardening and ice cream, rather than violation notices. Neighbors were friendlier, more relaxed, more united. They'd stop by not to whisper about Doris, but to chat, to offer help with baby preparations, to drop off small, thoughtful gifts, often accompanied by a heartfelt, "Thank you for standing up to the Dragon Lady, Mike. You're a legend." One sunny Saturday afternoon, I was meticulously, if a little nervously, assembling a fiendishly complicated Swedish-designed baby crib in the nursery, which Sarah had painted a calming, decidedly non-beige shade of seafoam green. I glanced out the window. Doris Miller was puttering in her front yard, meekly attempting to use a tape measure on a neighbor's newly installed, and by the old draconian standards, slightly too tall and far too colorful, bird feeder. The neighbor, a burly biker dude named Spike who had previously lived in mortal terror of Doris's clipboard, just grinned, gave her a cheerful two-fingered wave, and then winked broadly in my direction. Doris sighed, a sound like the last puff of air from a deflating bouncy castle, put her tape measure away, and shuffled back inside her beige fortress. Later that day, Sheriff Jim Brody, making a slow, deliberate pass through the neighborhood on a routine patrol, saw me struggling with a rogue crib leg on the front porch. He pulled over, rolled down his window, and gave me a slow, appreciative nod and a definite thumbs up. "Looking good, Henderson," he called out. "Neighborhood's looking good too, quieter, saner." I just grinned and waved back. I went inside and found Sarah resting peacefully on the porch swing, her hand on her belly, a contented smile on her face as she watched a pair of bright yellow and probably unapproved butterflies flit amongst her now thriving sunflowers. "Turns out," I said, settling beside her and taking her hand, "the most effective countermeasure to a petty tyrant armed with a badly written rulebook and an overdose of self-importance isn't necessarily a better lawyer or a louder argument." Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder. "No?" "Nope," I confirmed. "It's a good friend with a badge, an encyclopedic knowledge of county ordinances, a county-wide emergency communication system at his immediate fingertips, and a very, very low tolerance for bullies who pick on heavily pregnant ladies and their lucky birthing socks." She giggled, a lovely, happy sound. "I guess the rules are the rules, after all." "They are indeed," I said, looking out at our peaceful, slightly more colorful, and infinitely less beige cul-de-sac. "And one of the unwritten ones, at least here in Williamson County, is this. You don't mess with a woman whose husband designed the sheriff's emergency speed dial and knows precisely how and when to use it." The neighborhood was still working on achieving true serenity, but it was definitely a much more pleasant path, and a heck of a lot less like a primrose-tinted nightmare. And somewhere in the distance, I could almost swear I heard the faint, joyful, and entirely regulation-free chiming of Mrs. Periwinkle's wind chimes.